Hi, comrades. Thanks very much for having me here to speak with you today. My name is Madeleine Freeman, and I'm a member of the editorial board of LeftVoice, the English language section of La Izquierda Diario International Network. I'm speaking to you here today from New York City, where after 5 days of counting ballots and escalating tensions across the country, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have just won the presidential election, ousting Donald Trump and Mike Pence after just 4 years in office. All over the United States, people are out in the streets celebrating this as a huge victory against the right, and the bourgeois media is trying to paint this as a decisive victory for democracy in the United States. And even many on the left, from the reformist sectors of the DSA to sectors of the Black Lives Matter movement, are claiming Biden's election as a victory. They may not like Biden's policy, but they do celebrate Trump's defeat, and they have real illusions, that a Biden presidency represents a return to normalcy that puts them and the entire working class on better footing to fight for their demands. But as we've said frequently from the pages of LeftVoice, while we too are happy we're happy to see Donald Trump's removal from office, of course, we know that Biden's win is not a victory for working people and the oppressed across the world. It's not a victory for the Black Lives Matter movement or for the working class abroad who will feel the effects of U.S. imperialist aggression. It's not a victory for the millions of people who will suffer capitalist attacks under a Biden administration as the economic crisis deepens. And the results of this election showed nothing else than that U.S. democracy is struggling to keep its balance as the world watches. And if anything, this election has shown us that shows us the contours of a deep social and political crisis that's unfolding in the United States, one that has its origins in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and which saw the rise of Donald Trump and the popular movement around Bernie Sanders in 2016. By all indications, Joe Biden's election is not the conclusion of this process, but the beginning of another chapter in it, the part of a lengthy crisis that will continue to plague the U.S. regime and the bourgeois interests that it represents. Because according to all of the bourgeois polls, this was supposed to be a landslide victory for Biden, for Kamala Harris, and the Democratic Party. More specifically, it was supposed to be a referendum on Donald Trump and the rejection of everything that he stood for. The combination of a catastrophic mishandling of the pandemic, the freefall of the economy, and Trump's rejection and criminalization of the Black Lives Matter movement was supposed to hand Biden the presidency on a silver platter. Indeed, as sectors of capital lined up behind Biden in the weeks leading up to the election, it seemed sure that he'd win by huge margins. But what we saw instead was an election that was much closer than expected, with huge turnouts for both bourgeois candidates. Biden may have won more votes than Obama did in 2008, but Trump won more votes than he did in 2016. Biden only beat him by a couple of percentage points. And so while Biden was able to flip states that went to Trump in 2016 and to flip others that historically went to Republicans before that, what the huge turnout for Trump shows us is that Trumpism itself is unlikely to go away just because Trump leaves office. There are still entire sectors of the population, sectors that grew in this election, that see Trump as a viable alternative to the status quo neoliberalism that bailed out Wall Street in 2008 and left millions of people to go bankrupt, to lose their jobs, businesses, and homes, and to go massively into debt. And then, of course, there's the far-right white supremacist sector of Trump's base that, as we saw during the Black Lives Matter movement, has become emboldened by 4 years of a Trump presidency. They might be small and relatively unorganized, but it's clear that they're not going away. And now that Trump is saying that the election was stolen from him, now that he's trying to contest the results, they're likely to mobilize to defend him in some ways, and as many already have outside of polling stations and in cities across the country this week. And so this all paints a picture of a polarized electorate, one that's artificially divided between bourgeois visions of how to respond to the current crisis without with, on the one hand, neoliberal establishment on the one hand and right-wing populist rhetoric on the other. But I say artificially because the Democrats and the Republicans, of course, hold a monopoly on political power in the United States. There's a whole host of institutional and subjective factors that stand in the way of the emergence of so-called third parties in the electoral arena. And so while the U.S., like any other country, is politically diverse, millions of people who are forced to choose between two candidates who stand in complete opposition to the issues that are most important to them. The working class has no political representation of its own. And so while Joe Biden and old school neoliberalism may have won this time around, they did so without overwhelming enthusiasm. Though, of course, there are sectors who have illusions in Biden and Harris to bring the U.S. back to normal. After 4 years of Trump, there are still many others who voted for Biden just because he's not Trump. And this, of course, has important implications for the socialist left in the United States and the prospects moving forward. More particularly, that Joe Biden was able to secure the presidency at all is due in no small part to the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was an uprising of unprecedented proportion in the United States that brought millions of people, many of them part of a multiracial, newly radicalized generation of young people, into the streets for months on end, day after day, night after night. They calling for the defunding or even the abolition of the police. These protests revealed the cracks in the racist foundations of U.S. capitalism. And as you know, they had reverberations across the world. They showed a new generation of people, not only that the police are beyond reform, but that, in fact, they're part of a much larger system that's designed to oppress the working class. And this expressed itself importantly in the fact that the anti-police uprisings in the U.S. held a majority of public support. As we're fond of saying here, at one point, the burning down of a police station in Minneapolis had higher approval ratings than Trump. And this support expressed itself in the election results. Surveys taken after voters cast their ballots this year indicate that the second most important issue on voters' minds during the election was race. This shows, on the one hand, the immense strength and influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, but on the other hand, it shows that the Democratic Party, in no small part due to its newly revitalized progressive wing, and despite its long history of racist policies and pandering, was able to co-opt the movement and funnel its energy into support at the polls. Because though Joe Biden made his career in the Senate with segregationist policies, even though he wrote legislation that put millions of Black people into prison and chose a running mate who calls herself the top cop, he and the Democratic Party are seen by many as a lesser evil to Donald Trump, who was a president who sent in the National Guard to repress protests, who called on his far-right base to restore law and order, and who criminalized protesters standing up against police terror and anti-Black racism. So in this way, the rejection of Trump in the elections this year, explicitly because of his xenophobic and white supremacist policies, shows a certain leftward shift of the consciousness of a large sector of the public, who overwhelmingly, as I said, supported the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. But if we consider this support for Biden by looking at the organized left in the U.S., we see something else entirely, right? We see instead a definitive shift to the right and a further legitimization of the Democratic Party and the U.S. political system as a whole as a vehicle for progressive change, as a tool to fight against the right, or even to help along in the fight for socialism. And that's what the revolutionary left is up against as Joe Biden prepares to take office next year. And as I said before, the issue of class independence is already an uphill battle in the US, on the U.S. left, as we saw with the sweeping support for Bernie Sanders, who ran on the Democratic Party ticket. But the support for Joe Biden was something else. As soon as he became the Democratic Party candidate, the logic of lesser evilism held unchallenged influence over the socialist left, whether it was reformist organizations or centrist groups that call themselves revolutionary. No one was saying not to vote for Joe Biden, or very few people were. The choice was presented as nothing less than Biden versus fascism. People were saying that a vote for Biden was really only a vote for Donald Trump, even though the politician they were calling on people to vote for is a bourgeois candidate who offered absolutely nothing to the left, who's a proud imperialist, who's a racist, sexist, who's a friend of Wall Street, and who categorically rejects every single policy that many people on the left organized very hard for over the last several years, and a candidate who lines up with Trump on many of the issues, even though his rhetoric is different. And despite all of this, there were virtually no calls against voting for Biden anywhere in the left, or making any attempt as the working class to create our own political representation. Just as a small example, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a multi-tendency organization of over 70,000 members, basically threw its weight behind Biden. After spending years campaigning for Bernie Sanders and railing against the political establishment and calling for political revolution, they stepped right in line behind Biden and the Democratic Party. And though as an organization they never endorsed Biden officially, most of their members campaigned for Biden, most of them voted for Biden, and all of their endorsed candidates who are in the Democratic Party supported Biden and openly called for unity with him against Trump. There was no significant pressure from within that organization to organize for class independence in a way that could have had a decisive impact. Importantly, though, this put these organizations, the DSA and others, squarely to the right of the vanguard of the Black Lives Matter movement, whose experience over the summer being beaten by the cops on the orders of both Democrats and Republicans alike taught them to mistreat both parties of capital. And rather than push these sectors to the conclusion of class independence by providing an alternative, rather than trying to link the anti-racist movement with the labor movement, these organizations, which didn't have strong roots in the BLM movement to begin with, simply allowed the movement to be largely co-opted by the Democratic Party and to direct its energy towards the polls. And that means that they also didn't appeal to other sectors of the population who also don't have illusions in the two-party system. And so as LeftVoice, as a publication, throughout the election, we maintained a position of class independence, saying that a vote for either candidate of capital undermined socialist effort to become a political force in their own right. On our website and in our interventions on the ground in the Black Lives Matter movement and within sectors of healthcare workers, we fought hard against the idea that Joe Biden, who's a proponent of the Iraq War, a vice president who supported drone strikes and millions of deportations, who said that he'd tell cops to shoot people in the leg, was some sort of alternative for the working class and oppressed. We argued against the idea that the Democratic Party could do anything or would do anything to stop the rise of the right, which is a real worry for millions of people across the country. Instead, we argued for the working class and oppressed to form their own political organizations that could actually stand a chance against the attacks of the right, against the austerity that's sure to follow the economic crisis under a Biden administration, and against the imperialist attacks that both parties will use to oppress the working class across the world. We argued for the necessity of the movement in the streets against police terror to link up with the labor movement and the struggle of essential workers fighting for safe conditions during the pandemic, using our website to reach many more people than we physically have. We use these sort of unpopular views to discuss against the logic of lesser evilism with our readers and periphery, and to argue for the need for independent political organization of the working class. And now that Biden has won the presidency, the sectors of the left who said that they'd vote for him on election day and then fight against him the very next day are going to be put to the test. And so that means that the most pressing task for the revolutionary left in the United States is to dispel any illusions that people might have in the Democratic Party, whether it's the newly radicalized sectors from Bernie Sanders in 2016 or those in the BLM movement. We need to lead them to the conclusion that we have to build a fighting organization of our own to face the next period, to show that the only solutions to the crises that we face are in the hands of a united working class that uses its own methods to fight for its interests. But there's a long way to go, of course, before Biden takes office, and time's not going to just stand still until January. With the simmering BLM movement and the resurgence of the pandemic and the continuing economic crisis, it's likely that the terrain of class struggle is going to shift in the coming months. And of course, the way that a Biden presidency will go and the prospects for the revolutionary left in the U.S. in this period of crisis depends entirely on the development of this class struggle and the continued crisis of the U.S. political parties. Meanwhile, the Black Lives Matter movement has surely retreated, but it hasn't disappeared. There's still a small vanguard that has returned to the streets in the aftermath of the elections, who are calling into question the undemocratic nature of the electoral system and continuing to protest Trump's attempts to contest the election. And these protests are in no way massive, but what they show is that tensions are still building. Though the elections have released some of the pressure, there's still no resolution. There was never any resolution to the challenges posed to the regime by the Black Lives Matter movement. Therefore, there is space opening for the revolutionary left to push for revolutionary conclusions, to highlight the undemocratic nature of the regime, and to dispel any illusions at all that the Democratic Party would stand with the anti-racist movement in the streets under a Biden presidency. Because while there might be a change in who sits in the White House, what's not going to change is that the state is going to systematically murder Black and brown people with relative impunity, and neither political party will be able to resolve this. And it's likely that any resurgence in class struggle will, of course, will occur first within the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, the pandemic and all of this and the economic crisis aren't going to go away. Coronavirus cases and deaths are on the rise across the country, especially in rural areas that are the base of Trump's support and which were not hit hard by the first and second waves, and we're facing the threat of another shutdown. And the economic situation is still very much in flux. Though Wall Street has gotten its president, the majority of working people and poor people continue to suffer the effects of the recession, and Biden is going to be the one tasked with addressing both the pandemic and the economic crisis, likely by trying to implement classical neoliberal austerity, which will spell disaster for millions of poor and working class people. And right now, there's not much activity from the sectors of essential workers who spearheaded the struggle at the beginning of the year. But as we enter new phases of the pandemic and the economic crisis, it's not out of the question that we'll see a revival of class struggle there. And then in the political terrain, though the Democratic Party now holds control over the presidency and the House of Representatives, the Senate's likely going to the Republicans. And this is the best scenario for the sectors of capital who will capitalize off of the stability of a Biden presidency and take advantage of the blockage of any remotely progressive reforms in the Republican-controlled Senate. And so in a sense, this presents a challenge for any potential concessions to the working class from a Biden administration, but subjectively, the expectations of the masses are high. They don't like Biden. They don't have any enthusiasm for him. And the sectors that were awakened by the Sanders campaign in 2016 and the BLM movement this year show no signs of going back to sleep. They're demanding change that the current order just can't give them, though it might be forced to try, right? So the scenario provides ample space for the revolutionary left to intervene with its politics, both in defending itself against the right wing and the deepening economic crisis. It'll be a difficult road ahead for the fight against both reformism and a sector that rejects bourgeois politics altogether. But in the last year, we've seen immense shifts in consciousness, first with the opening of class struggle by essential workers in the early days of the pandemic, and then by the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement in the streets. And if we know one thing for certain, it's that the bourgeois regime will have ample opportunities to slip up in the coming period of crisis. And this opens new terrain in which the revolutionary left could emerge as a tendency truly capable of having influence in class struggle that materializes in the coming period, and of uniting the anti-racist movement in the streets with the struggle of the labor movement. This opens space to fight for the perspective of class independence and of building organizations of our own that will fight against every attack against the working class in the United States and across the world with the perspective of fighting for socialism.